Hello guys, what is up? Bringing you a new podcast today. I am super excited for today's podcast. It is the second episode of the Hockey Analytics podcast. The first episode, I discussed most of the major stats, I should say. Maybe I missed a couple, depending on who you ask, of course. I discussed their formulas and their use. So if you guys want to go check that out, go to my channel. Also, if you enjoy content like this, like and subscribe, because it helps me a lot. You guys even get content for free. So it's a win-win on both sides. Anyway, so today I wanted to start off the second episode of the Hockey Analytics podcast with possibly the biggest hockey question ever. Who is better, Wayne Gretzky or Bobby Orr? One was a trailblazing defenseman who played for the Bruins, won back-to-back cups, but was unfortunately injury-prone and vanished almost as soon as he appeared. The other was a long-tenured veteran scorer who basically rewrote the scoring record book and led one of the most successful dynasties ever. And now we're pitting them against each other, as so many before me have done. But I don't think anyone before me has done it quite as I have. Today we will be discussing the model that I built myself. And I'll discuss all the mistakes I made, how I fixed them, and I think that'll give you guys a little insight on if you build a model and in the midst of successfully using it, you run into some problems. There's always a way to fix it. Don't just scrape it. There's always a way to adjust the model. Like, my original model is so incredibly different from the model that I rewrote after I completed using it. Like, it's so different. I changed almost every step. So, that just goes to show you guys that the original model is usually not going to end up being successful because there'll be some unforeseen problems along the way, but there's still some use in it. So, with that, let's get started. Also, by the way, I did spend like 15 hours or something, something relatively big like that. Like, it took a long time to build this model and successfully complete it, so I would really appreciate it. If you be patient, as I won't be posting these too often, considering the considerable amount of time each one requires to produce. So, sorry for the long intro, but without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so step one on my model is to maximize both players' totals. So one of the major problems that I had to overcome was Orr. Gretzky was less a problem because he basically played the ideal career. Almost never got injured, played on one of the best offensive teams of all time, in the best offensive era of all time, and had some lean talent and skill. I guess they mean the same thing. So, I don't really have to fix him at all, because he's essentially the ideal player. Or had the talent, played on a really good team, and really didn't have the rest. He was severely injury prone, played in less of a scoring era, as you guys will find out. And, so I had to adjust for those problems. So the first one I decided to tackle was Orr being injury prone. So the easiest way to do that is to maximize both players' totals. And you do that by simply multiplying the points per game, the goals per game, and the assists per game by a full 82 games for each individual year that the player played. And then you essentially compare them that way. And so that quickly eliminates the problem of Orr was injury prone. And then, so now that problem's fixed, you calculate the average league goals per game average over the span of both of their careers, then divide them by each other, and move decimal point over. Then you have the percentage to regress, or upgress, a term I invented. It essentially means to upgrade, to pad, to move up, that kind of thing, in terms of stats, to adjust by era at the end. So the second problem was obviously adjusting for era. Or played in an era where you didn't score as much, so I had to fix that problem. So that was the way I did it. So I took the goals per game average of both players' careers. So the goals per game average in terms of the league is the average goals scored per game over every National Hockey League game played in any individual year. There's a great article on Hockey Reference, which is one of the sites I recommended in the first episode of this podcast in terms of getting stats and stuff. And it has a great article called League Averages, where it has, well, the league averages of every year. So it's extremely useful. I found it useful many times in the past, and it was extremely useful in this model as well. So I simply took the average league goals per game of both players' careers, and then I divided them by each other. So Gretzky's in his career was 3.49, and Orr's was 3.31. So I divided 3.49 by 3.31, and it equaled 1.05. I moved the decimal point over to the right, and I have 10.5%. So, now we have the percentage to regress or upgress in Orr's case in order to adjust by era, and so that should fit. Then I had to adjust for position. So Orr played as a defenseman, and History Pros, or Study Show, I guess, and as I'll show you later in just a second, that defensemen score less than forwards, especially during Orr's time when he was really the trailblazer. So I had to factor for position when I was doing scoring totals to determine who was the better scorer, if, I guess, Orr was a forward or if Gretzky was a D-man. So in order to do that, I calculated the average points by the top 15 forward and defenseman scores from every year in both players' careers. This took a long time, took a lot of printing, took a lot of calculating, but it's finally done. So for example, let's do a quick demonstration here. In 1980-81, the average amount of points among the top 15 forward scorers was 112.2. And the top 15 D-men in 1980-81 scores were 67.06. So that result shows you that the forward scored significantly more, almost double, what the defenseman did. And I just did that for every single year in both players' careers. Then I divided each year's results by each other. Then you have the percentage from that year to regress or upgress in order to adjust for position at the end. So for example, you take 1980-81's totals, and you do 112.2 divided by 67.06. That equals 1.67, sorry. And then you move the decimal point over to the right, and you have 16.7%. And so for that particular year, if you were just doing that 1 year, you would regress by 16.7% if you were simply doing by position for that 1 year. But then you repeat that for each year, which I obviously did. Then you get the average. So the average, one of the percentages that I just said in step 4, step 5, and do it for their separate careers. So for example, I would do Gretzky's career percentage that I just mentioned, which, in case you need a reminder, 112.2 divided by 67.06, which eventually turns into 16.7%. I would recommend turning on subtitles for this for any podcasts you listen to, but the Hockey Analytics podcast especially, because it can get complicated when I'm trying to explain things I've done. So, like right now. So, if you guys remember, the average top 15 player points was 112.2, and the D-min total was 67.06. You divide them by each other, and you get 16.7%. Then you repeat that for each year in each player's separate careers. So then you take that number of Gretzky's entire career, you average it out, and you find that that average percentage is 16.32% of Gretzky's entire career. Then you do the same for Orr, and that ends up being 18.6%. Then you add up all the maximized career totals for both players. So that ends up being, for Gretzky, 1640 games played, because I matched it to 82, 954 goals scored, 2,129 assists put in, and 3,089 points for 1.88 points per game average. Or, he ended up only playing 11 seasons. So his total was, well, less. Like, he had 820 games played, 349 goals, 875 assists, and 1,229 points and a 1.49 points per game average. However, that's only for the first 10 seasons. I kind of forgot to adjust for his 11th one. So, but I just decided to take out the 11th one during my totals, as he only played 20 games in it. So it's not a big enough sample size. I also removed the last year of his career, which was with the Blackhawks in 77-78, because he only played 6 games and got 4 points. So I didn't think that was a big enough sample size to maximize that. And then you add up the percentage to either regress or upgress, which is combining the factor for both position and era, and then regress or upgress the career maximized stats with that percentage. So, for example, with using all the examples that I've told you back from step 2 and from step 4, you add up 10.5 and 16.32% from Gretzky's. So 16.32% is the average of Gretzky's career in order to adjust for position. And then the 10.5 is to adjust for era. You add them up, you get 26.82%. And then you either upgrade upgress or down or regress based on that percentage. So in Orr's case, you would upgress it. So his max points is 1229, and you would upgress it or add it to 26.82%, and that equals 1464. Now you could do that with goals and assists too. I chose not to. I figured just using my leaderboard, I figured I'd just do points and instead of just goals and assists. And then I want one number. Ideally, I wanted one numerical value or one number to represent each player in the end. I figured that would be a lot easier to compare to. I think that's pretty fair. So every 10 points, one player is ahead of the other in the maximized career totals. You get 1 point on my leaderboard. And it's the same with plus minus. So I add a total plus minus for both players' career. So every plus 5, one player is ahead of another in their career. They get 1 point on my leaderboard as well. After I've done all that, I assign the points to the leaderboard. And then I also wanted to factor in awards. This is significantly easier. So I simply rated every position out of 10. So if you're curious about that, the Stanley Cup's rated 1.0, so 10 out of 10. I know it's not an individual trophy, so I considered having it lower, not having it at all, but I figured it was too important. Hart Trophy 0.9, Ted Lindsay 0.9, Art Ross 0.8, Rock Richard 0.8, Norris and Vezina 0.7, as well as the Conn Smythe. The Selke is 0.6, Calder is 0.5, Lady Bain is 0.4, and Bill Meston is 0.2. Better. Okay, I'll do it in a second. So those were the ratings out of 10, simply with the decimal point moved. Then I multiplied that by the amount of awards that they won. So Gretzky, for example, won 4 Stanley Cups. I would multiply that by 1, because moving the decimal point makes it 1.0, or 1. Then you simply multiply them. So 4 times 1 equals 4. And then that adds 4 points to my leaderboard. And then if you want another example, or you would do 8 Norris trophies times 0.7 on my leaderboard equals 5.6. Now you've adjusted now you've also done awards, and then you add all those points up. Gretzky gets 28 points in terms of awards, or gets 14.7. Now, finally, after adjusting for era, position, finding average points of the top 15 scorers of both forward and defenseman, as well as adjusting for awards and defense, we have finally come to our conclusion. Or comes down to, with adding the 26.82% to him because he played in a lower scoring era and he was a D-man, he gets 426 goals, 1,032 assists for 1,464 points in 820 games. And then compare that to Gretzky, who, after subtracting the fact that he played in a higher scoring era, so 10.5, as well as subtracting the fact that he played as a forward rather than a D-man, so 16.32, his totals end up being 349 goals, 778 assists for 1,129 points. So, Orr got a plus 67 in scoring because every 5 points ahead he was in points. Sorry, every 5 points he was ahead of Gretzky. He would get 1 point on my leaderboard, so he ended up with a plus 67. He also gets 14.7 points for awards in total. As well, his plus minus was plus 574, and Gretzky's was plus 520. So every 5 points he got ahead he was of Gretzky in the plus minus leaderboard. He would get 1 point on my leaderboard, like on my actual leaderboard. And so that ended up coming to a plus 5 on my leaderboard for a grand total of 186.7 points. Gretzky got 28 points for awards, and that's it. He got no points for scoring because he was behind Orr in every area after regressing him and upgressing Orr. And this was also after cutting Gretzky's career down in half so that they would play the equal amount of years, just to let you know, because I forgot to mention that. And then he also doesn't get any for plus minus, considering he was behind Orr in plus minus. So he just ends up with 28 points. So in my leaderboard, Orr gets 186.7, Gretzky gets 28. So I don't know truthfully how well this model works. Like, analysts always say that it has to pass the smell test, and this one sure does not seem like it really did. It would seem a lot more even if I decided to assign points to a person that had less career points. Like if I just decided to assign points to Gretzky due to the fact that he had points and a really good plus minus, then it would look a lot more equal. But Orr was the only one that could get points because he was ahead of Gretzky. Therefore, it makes it look more lopsided than it really is. But truthfully, they come out pretty close to even. Gretzky comes out of it with a really good 1,129 points in 820 games, which is still fantastic. And that's after regressing his totals down by 25%. So that total may seem a bit too high. But as I told you guys, I simply divided the forward scoring by the D-man scoring, and then that's total that came up with. So anyway, that's it's an interesting result. The leaderboard I don't think represents totally how close it was, but it was really close. Yeah, now I'm going to talk about some mistakes I made, and I promised I would do that at the start of this episode, so I am going to do it. The first mistake I made, I decided at first to subtract the players, the top 15 forward scoring by the top 15 D-men scoring, and then turn the result into a percentage. So that ended up with crazy results, like in 1980-81, I would regress Gretzky stats by 45.14%. And I just kept doing this. And, you guys should have seen my first results. It was, 190 to 28 or something. A lot of significantly bigger. I think in terms of scoring, Orr got, 30 more points because I simply regressed Gretzky's stats that much more and upgressed Orr's that much more. Orr, with the upgress that I gave him originally, he was on pace for, 4,000 points if he had played out his entire career. So that did not pass the smell test in any way for me. It wasn't even close. So I adjusted it, I tried dividing them, and it came out with a lot more suitable percentage. So instead of, in 1980-81, 45.14, it came out 16.7, which seemed a lot more reasonable to me. Another mistake I made, I assumed that, I decided at first that I would try multiplying I decided at first to do the top 25 forwards in D-men, and then ultimately decided not to. And I would multiply the points by the goals per game average that I came up with, except that doesn't work. That only works with points per game, but I didn't really think of that at the time. Another thing on my very first sheet is that I originally had it where I would only be regressing by 1%. I wasn't really factoring for era. As well, midway through, I almost decided not to adjust for error at all, because I simply decided to subtract the total goals per game in Gretzky's career, 3.49, and then subtract that by 3.31, and then simply subtract the result of that, which ended up being 0.18. Subtract that by the amount of points each player got in the top 15 scoring. And of course, that ends up regressing at basically none at all. So I just assumed I had done it correctly, but it just didn't make that much of a difference. And I almost went along without bothering to factor in for error. And then ultimately decided not to in the end, when I still had time to do that. And I'm really glad I did that. And then one more thing, I did have, originally I had a team quality model where Gretzky would get, or would get a points for every extra Hall of Famer Gretzky had. That every extra Hall of Famer Gretzky played with during his career. I decided not to do this. First of all, it's a crude model. And second of all, it's not really fair to Gretzky, as Gretzky played double the years Orr did. Therefore, he's bound to have played with more Hall of Famers. As well, just because you played with more Hall of Famers does not mean you played with them in your prime. You could have played with a Hall of Famer, when they were 41 years old, and then they're not producing, a first-line forward or a top-pair defenseman or an elite goalie. Therefore, they're not as useful, and yet you're still losing a point on the leaderboard. As well, who should be in the Hall of Fame is very subjective. I don't think Kevin Lau should be in the Hall of Fame, but the Hall of Fame thinks Kevin Lau should be in the Hall of Fame. And that's what matters. So, I wouldn't want to take away a point from Gretzky for that, because I don't think Lau was playing at Hall of Fame level. But, I would have to in this case. So, I plan on building a bit better of a team quality model at some point in the future. Let me know what you guys want to see in the future of this podcast. I really actually did, despite all my complaining and the fact that it did take a lot of work and a lot of time, I ultimately really enjoyed building my own model and comparing players on it. So I think that's really cool. I'm working on something right now where, if you guys listen to the first podcast, I'm using a stat called presence, and I'm making a goalie version to compare the value of goalies to players, because that's a pretty hard issue, and I do have a couple players in mind to compare to each other, and because it's not really easy to compare goalies and players. Usually you just compare them, but the goalies are kind of against the goalies and the players are against the players, and so you're comparing them compared to their peers, which is not right, because the value of a goalie is going to be different than the value of a player, right? So anyway, guys, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. Please do like and sub, and leave your ideas in the comments down below. Have a good day. Bye-bye.